This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Like many other educators, school librarians are wearing a lot of different hats these days. They're helping students make up academic ground lost during the pandemic, working with teachers to put together engaging lessons, and responding to a surge in demands that certain reading materials be removed from the shelves. We're going to talk about all of these challenges with today's guest. She is Kara Yorio, the news editor of the School Library Journal, and she oversaw the most recent issue, which is a deep dive into the state of the profession. Kara, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Is there a typical day for a school librarian right now? Does such a thing exist?
Before the pandemic, such a thing didn't exist. One of the reasons we wanted to do this project the way we did, which was sort of in narrative form, is that the job is so different from place to place, district to district, and that's assuming people have librarians in the buildings in the first place. So right now they are doing exactly what you said. They're trying to help everyone catch up. They're fighting these challenges. They're working tech. They're doing everything, I think. They're the Renaissance people of the school buildings most of the time.
I think when people think about school librarians, whether this is accurate or not, we do tend to think of them in a very particular kind of physical space, maybe standing behind a circular counter, checking out books, bookshelves around them, maybe walking up and down rows of students working on media literacy projects on computers. So what happened during the pandemic when physical schools closed? What did librarians do?
Well, again, it varied, but when schools closed down, obviously the libraries closed and the ability for them to let students access collections stopped. A lot of times the librarian is in charge of the website or technology at the school. Many of them had to pivot to, honestly, tech support, much to their dismay. They had to update their libraries and their collections of electronic books. And they did a lot of reaching out to students, trying to get them the resources. They helped classroom teachers with technology, with Flipgrid, with Google Classroom for those that didn't know. So they became really heavy on the tech side. And then as people became more familiar with that, they tried harder and harder to work in the access to books. And there were more than a handful across the country that led efforts to bring books from their libraries to kids' homes just so they would have some physical books to read during the school building's closure.
Your reporting focused on a new study out of Antioch University in Seattle, which found that about 20% of school librarian positions disappeared between 2009 and 2019. That's a pretty high number, but it's a complicated number too, isn't it? Because some of this is about definitions. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We love the slide report, which is what you're speaking of by Deborah Cagle and Keith Curry-Lance. But the numbers are hard. It's not really great data because librarians across the country have different titles. They have different responsibilities. Many are working multiple libraries and multiple buildings in a district. There's definitely been loss, but you just take California, for instance, which shows a huge drop, 75% over that decade, which is immense. There are some districts that changed the way they designated the librarians so that they couldn't be a single line deletion in a budget, but there still was an awful lot of loss there. And when you redesignate, you also change responsibilities, even if you don't want to. There's a lot of librarians who are put in the specialist category with, say, art and music and physical education teachers. And then they're also required to cover a teacher prep period or cover a lunch period. So they lose out a little bit on what they can do as far as in their media center and their libraries.
I was pretty fascinated by that report, and I went to take a closer look at it. And I did look at California because that 75% number jumped out at me. And I was really interested to see that some school districts started renaming their librarians to protect them from budget cuts. Can you explain that?
Sure. I mean, when superintendents and boards are looking at budgets, they want to find the easiest thing, right? So if you can see a single line cut that takes away a certain amount of money, and you can say things like, well, English teachers have their own classroom libraries. There's a lot of a lack of education about what school librarians do now, what they can do. They are more than a circulation desk. They are news literacy. They help with research and fact checking, and they run maker spaces and tech and STEM and a lot of what some people call those soft skills, a lot of social emotional learning. They provide a space for kids who need it. And they're called many different things. They're library media specialists, they're school librarians, they're teacher librarians. Some states require a teaching certificate, some don't. In the places that do, they could be designated just as teacher instead. It's one of the many reasons why getting hard data on school librarians is really difficult, and why we wanted to really take this data as a foundation, but then branch out and really share the narrative stories, because they really tell the picture a little bit better.
What I think there's some irony here. I mean, if I was a middle school or junior high student and my teacher wanted me to do a story or project on the state of school libraries, and I went to the librarian and said, I've got this report and this number is really big. And that's exactly what a librarian would do, right? They would show the kid how to find the actual report, how to read it, how to interrogate some of that data. Is that media literacy?
It absolutely is. And it's analysis of data. It's very important skills. And the students would come away as frustrated as I am, quite frankly. And it is of no fault of the researchers by any stretch. They're pretty much the only ones trying to pull together this information, but states report differently. And there isn't a lot of money for these studies, right? And if you look, there are a bunch of studies, there are more than 20 that confirm that having a school librarian and a school library helps students in academic achievement. It boosts reading scores. It boosts math scores. It helps graduation rates. It helps with civic engagement. A lot of these librarians are working with students in communities. They're doing voting registration. They're doing civics projects. But there just isn't really the good tracking of this kind of information that they need. And quite frankly, that librarians need to advocate to keep their positions.
What do we know right now about whether districts are going to prioritize school libraries when spending some of the billions of dollars that's coming from Congress and that COVID relief money? Do you have any sense from librarians right now? I mean, I know the data is hard to find, but even anecdotally.
Well, this is where you have to go to the superintendents. And I tell you what, it could be a boon. It could be a profession altering change if this money comes in the way they would like it to. Organizations like Every Library, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization, sees huge possibilities. But the problem is, again, these are going to be local decisions, right? And there's a superintendent in Tuscaloosa City. His name is Michael Daria. And Dr. Daria is a huge proponent of libraries and librarians. And he's planning to use a lot of the money to boost the libraries in his district that don't have great programs, and to help the librarians that do to better their programs. But then you've got other places, Camden, New Jersey, for instance. The superintendent there said she'd love to use the money to bring back librarians. They haven't been in that district in a decade, but she needs to use it for other stuff, and she doesn't want to bring them back in a way that's not going to be sustainable if this money runs out. So unfortunately, like so many things in education, it is district by district, state by state.
Do the districts who do not have enough librarians have anything in common in terms of their communities or their student demographics?
Yeah, well, like everything else, you're going to find an equity issue here. These are districts that are low income. They are largely Black and brown students. They are, districts that struggle. They struggle with funding. They struggle bringing in good teachers. And then the other thing that I think is interesting, that shouldn't surprise anyone, but the thing that I find is interesting is you will see more school librarians in areas within a certain distance of colleges and universities that have programs for school librarians, and there aren't a ton of them, right? So a lot of times, again, the certification process is different, and a lot of school librarians get their MLIS, so the Masters in Library and Information Science, but you can look at it sort of geographically and see these kind of pods of school librarians around universities that have the programs.
On the flip side, what do we know about districts that have enough librarians?
Well, even in places where you don't get the state funding, when you have money in schools or money in parents, what you see is a lot of these situations where the district is going to cut the librarian and suddenly the parents fundraise and get the salary for another year, or the librarians pull together the money themselves. So certainly there are more school librarians in the wealthier, better funded districts. And in some of the ones that kind of teeter on the brink, fundraising things are done in kind of a hodgepodge sort of way to get them there year to year. But school librarians are truly, as different as they are than your core classroom educators, they are no different than so many when it comes to funding. When you're in a better funded district, they're going to be there. And when you're not, they're not.
Are there enough people training for this career, or are there people on this career path who can then choose a lot of different routes? Like if you decide maybe I don't want to work in a K-12 school, I want to be at a university or in a nonprofit setting, are those skills transferable? Does that make that harder here?
Oh, no, absolutely. These are skills that are transferable to so much. I mean, we talk about news literacy, media literacy, research. Certainly the tracks of education are different for school librarians, academic librarians, which are college and university librarians, and then also public librarians. I mean, they have the same basic program, but they track differently when they're in school. But the skills are all transferable. So certainly they could go to the tech side, they could become administrators, they could move into nonprofits.
You mentioned test scores as one measure of potentially a librarian's impact. Are there other quantifiable ways? Are there things that education journalists could be looking for in terms of data to try to find a connection between library staffing levels and librarians' impact on student learning?
Right. The problem is these are studies that show, okay, this school that has one, these are their numbers. And you have to kind of put it together until you get kind of a mass that shows, oh, wait, look, you see this trend between all the districts, all the schools with school librarians and quality programs, and these test score numbers and these graduation rates and all of this sort of civic engagement. So again, it's just such hard data to quantify, but you can look program to program, school to school. School librarians are like any other educator in that obviously you're going to get good ones and you're going to get not as good ones. But the really good ones, they're collaborating with other teachers. They're collaborating in some cases with universities. They work with their public libraries. They work with organizations within the community. This is where the story is so hard to tell, but you can see the impact in the people and in the programs. If you look specifically as far as, sort of education writers go in their local areas, if you look specifically at districts and specific schools, you can really see the impact there. It just takes some digging.
We're talking about challenges and opportunities for school librarians with Kara Yorio of the School Library Journal. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Kara, let's talk a little bit about a specific state, and that's Washington State, where lawmakers tried to make it a little bit more equitable and to add some more school librarians to schools in need, but it didn't quite go according to plan, did it?
It did not. The state of Washington was a huge advocacy and legislative victory for school librarians in 2009, 2010. And the problem was, quite frankly, also the case in New York and New York City in a way, which is also discussed in this story, which is that there was enough wiggle room in the legislation and not enough oversight of what was being done so that this money was dedicated to school libraries. However, there's an out. If a specific district or superintendent sees a larger need, they're able to move that money. Now, you can't move that money from an English program or a math program, but the school library program, they can. And that's what's been happening. And so in Washington State, where you'd think now when they won this legislative victory that they would be set, you look at places like Seattle and Spokane, and some districts have libraries, some don't. Some librarians are working 2-3 schools a week. It's really hard to sustain a quality program like that.
One of the concerns about school guidance counselors is that they are often saddled with administrative tasks that are not directly related to counseling students. I'm thinking about things like they become the de facto test prep administrator or oversee the answer sheets and corralling the test booklets on test day. Are there tasks or things that are now falling on librarians that really should be taken off that list?
No, absolutely. And those that you mentioned are there as well. The library space, if you think about it, in a school with enough space, the library is probably the biggest room. The media center is the biggest room they have. So let's look at schools that reopened during the pandemic, either hybrid or even to their full student body. A lot of those libraries were still closed as libraries because they were turned into classrooms. A lot of librarians are absolutely forced to not only test prep, but then stand over, their moderators for the test themselves. They do a lot of, again, tech administrative work, website work, tech support on Chromebooks and stuff like that. That, yes, I know that they would prefer not be part of their responsibilities, which would allow them to use their true skills a little more. But that's sort of just how it falls right now. They are a jack of all trades, and it's not always a good thing when administrators look down.
We're hearing rumblings and even some action from some state-level lawmakers threatening to ban books, and it's escalated in some places, including in Texas. This is a pendulum that we all know swings back and forth many times in many communities. It's certainly not unheard of for people to want to ban a particular book. What can you tell us right now about some of the titles that are cropping up to the top of those banned lists?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is something that's gone on for years. But what we're seeing now, according to the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom, is just an astronomical, which was their word, not mine, rise in these challenges. And what we're seeing is a coordinated effort of the anti-critical race theory people. It's a movement, really. And there's also, they're making big scenes at school board meetings. It's getting a lot of media play, so there's a lot more attention. But you saw beloved Toni Morrison's novel become an issue in the Virginia gubernatorial election. But there's so much more. I mean, Beloved's been a book that's been challenged for years. And for years and years, books with LGBTQ plus characters and themes were the ones that were most challenged. But what we're seeing now is race-based challenges to books that mention racism, that talk about racism, that are anti-racist, that talk about social justice, books that truly have nothing to do with any kind of political movement, but maybe about a young girl whose family immigrated from China and they opened a hotel. I'm talking about a book called Front Desk that people tried to ban on Long Island in New York. So it's not just happening in Texas, which I think is what everyone thinks because it's where most of the play is coming from, but Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Florida, obviously. I mean, people are coming down on any book, quite frankly, with characters or themes with Black and brown kids.
It seems to me that librarians are an underused source for reporters in that they could answer some interesting questions. And then one of them I'd want to talk about, and not just about if you're going to write a story about what books are being banned, would be to ask, what are the most popular books that are being taken out? What are you recommending to your young readers?
Well, absolutely, they're underutilized. I think they fly under the radar, sometimes at their own preference. But right now, they're the crossroads of this latest cultural war. Librarians in school districts that have proper policies, librarians set them. And then librarians are part of the review, even if it's a classroom book. There's some graphic novels. There's an author named Jerry Craft, a Black author. His book, Class Act, and New Kid, Class Act is the follow-up to New Kid, is about a young Black student who goes from the city to a private school to follow his gift of art. And, it talks about microaggressions. It talks about some racist things that he encounters. But really, it's just the story of a kid going through school. And it's an extremely popular series at all schools. And they're seeing that get challenged again. And you're also losing author visits. I think that school librarians could help education reporters really know what's going on in the school and where things might be self-censored and what really needs to happen. I mean, these books aren't supposed to be taken off the shelves for a challenge. Just because 1 or 5 or 10 parents stand up at a school board meeting and say, I'm offended by this title, it's not supposed to be removed from the shelves for all the other kids too. There's a lot of reactive behavior going on right now, and school librarians are the ones that set the policies that are or are not being followed.
We mentioned in passing, of course, the important role that librarians can play in students' social and emotional development. I mean, I can tell you, I was a library kid. I lived in the library. I went from the school library to my neighborhood library. I'm sure there's a wanted poster still on the wall for me because I had so many overdue books. I'd like to apologize to my childhood librarians for being such a pain in the neck. But they are sanctuaries, aren't they? They're safe havens.
They absolutely are. Time and time again, I hear from librarians who have kids that go there during lunch, which was something else that was really lost during COVID times. But they've become more than that in that it's not just necessarily a sanctuary for the kids that find lunch incredibly anxiety inducing, if not worse. But the libraries that have maker spaces have become these amazing places of invention and working together and these kinds of skills that will help them in the future. They're growing plants and they're creating apps, but they're a sanctuary, and they connect kids and they give kids a reason to want to come with things like the maker space or book contests. And, the loss of the library is much more than one line item on a budget.
If I'm an education journalist, what kind of questions should I be asking school librarians right now?
Well, right now, certainly your first question is about book challenges. I'd want to know what they've seen in the past, how different is this, and how they handle them. Ideally, you're talking a librarian or the classroom teacher and the parent, but that's not what's happening right now. A lot of these librarians have been threatened. They've been called out. Some have had tires slashed. I mean, they're dealing with the same sort of stuff that a lot of other, let's say the proponents of mask wearing in schools that went to school board meetings and spoke. I would ask them about that. I would ask them about technology. There's just so much that they know, so much that they do. They work with the other teachers. There isn't really, in a good library program, there isn't a part of the school that they're not involved in. And author visits are a big deal. They're getting canceled. They're getting canceled by the same people that want to take the books off the shelves. Right now, that is the main thing that I would be talking to librarians about.
If I was a local reporter, just based on what I've learned from your reporting, I would be trying to make sure that I understand what are the job titles, where's the overlap, have the job titles changed recently, and if so, why? What can anybody tell me about where those COVID dollars might be going? And just start by trying to get some kind of realistic framing on what the picture looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that requires going to many different people. You're talking the money, you're talking about the superintendents, and every state has their own school librarian association chapter. They're very helpful. They know exactly what's going on the ground. They have the good ones, like in Washington, they've got legislative advocates too. You want to know where they are as far as trying to get legislation to mandate and have oversight for librarians in every school. Places like Philadelphia, the Philadelphia school district, I believe, has what they say is about 9, because there's so many sort of half librarians, and you could talk about what is lost there. Oddly enough, if you're looking at charter schools have a dearth. They really, for whatever reason, don't have a lot of school librarians. They operate out of sort of classrooms and I guess under the idea that there wasn't much more that they did. But it's interesting to me that they don't use their funding to have a really robust program.
Are there other story ideas you'd like to see local reporters tackle?
Well, I would love to see local reporters really dive deep into their school librarians or what was lost. If you're in a district that doesn't have any, you might not have any that remember. The problem right now with funding is you've got people that are in administration on school boards and in the government, and it's possible they didn't have a school librarian for the last 7-10 years of their K-12 education. They have no idea what a school librarian can do. What we wanted to do and just didn't have the bandwidth to do is really dig at these local levels. And we told local stories that we tried to show a broader trend or a bigger picture. But this is one of those things where once you start digging, there's a lot more. And almost any education story, every budget story, every story about the school and the community or the culture that the school has, and literacies of all kind, media literacy, reading, all of that, a good school librarian will be able to be an excellent source for those stories.
Kara Yorio is news editor for the School Library Journal. Kara, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a reporter or a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Return those overdue books. And thank you for listening.